So, mic check, 1, 2, 3. Okay, today we're going to talk about the planet Pluto, and I've talked about this before several times. I have a podcast where I talk about Pluto and plutonic forces, especially Pluto as some type of unexpressed sexual desire. Okay, and I've also talked about what sexual desires really are. Because what they really are is a repressed form of knowledge. And the knowledge is different from the type of knowledge you find in textbooks and all that. It's a knowledge of self-awareness. The root cause of self-awareness. What it really means. Because let's put it this way. Sexuality is something that's very important to the natural world, especially for complex life forms. You have male females. And then these male females, it's almost like they live their entire lives for the purposes of breeding. For the purposes of having sex. So when you imagine the complex life form as the development of a nervous system, and as the nervous systems become more complex, the creatures tend to experience more intelligence. For instance, by the time you get from reptilian forms, you get to mammalian forms. The difference now is that mammals, they take care of their young, they feed them milk, but the development of a mammal leads to much greater intelligence. We can see that mammals exhibit more intelligence than reptiles. Well, what do you think is going on? Because people tend to think of this, and I thought of this at some point in time in this way, that what we're seeing are increasing developments in nervous systems, right? The nervous systems are becoming more complex. And as they're becoming more complex, they're becoming more intelligent, right? But what it really is that it is the sexual organ of the creature that is mandating ever more complex nervous systems. So we tend to think of the brain as the most important thing, and then everything else is built to sustain the survival of that brain, right? But I want you to think of it this way. It's the sexual organ that needs a brain, and the type of story the sexual organ is initiating is dependent on the type of brain associated with that sexual organ to process that story. In the case of the human being, you have the male sexual organ and the female sexual organ with very sophisticated brains that begin to tell stories that are decoupled from the type of stories and the limitations on stories that animals can tell. Because from the animal's point of view, its entire life revolves around finding food and then finding a mate. It doesn't know why it is doing this. It does that because it is programmed to do this in some sense. Now, as the nervous system becomes more complex, like in the case of mammals, these stories begin to become a little bit more diversified in the fact that mammals invest time in their young. They not only invest time, but they are more prone to be able to form social relationships. That is, the type of stories they are telling themselves, even though on an animalistic level, it begins to become sophisticated. Now, by the time you get to the primates, this sophistication reaches a type of zenith, because it doesn't go further than that. And then you have the case of the human being, that is like a trajectory that just goes all the way, zooms past what it means to be a mammal, and then zooms past what it means to be a primate, and goes all the way. It like transcends, or it cascades into a different level of reality, whereby these stories now explode in meaning. It's the same sexual story, but it now has as many branches as you can attach to it. And that's why I tell you that all our stories as human beings, they're sexual stories really. And the best type of sexual story are love stories. Because in love, we create a tremendous amount of meaning. But at the end of the day, underneath it all, the nucleus of it is sex. Alright, you think that's a coincidence? It's not. We as human beings, the fact that we are self-aware, the fact that we walk upright, we can stand upright, it's an elevation of the sexual function. That's what it means to actually walk upright. It's the sexual function that is now elevated. It can now begin to tell ever more complex, ever more beautiful stories. And so what the human being really is trying to do is to take the sexual function, the most basic nucleus of that sexual function, and to elevate it into something that is very beautiful and very good. We know that it's good because of the function, and that functionality is part of its beauty. Okay, so we get into relationships with each other. We raise a family. Why? Why do we need to do all of this? We can just have sex, impregnate, and just go away. The mother can give birth and abandon the baby and just walk away. No. The reason why we do this is because we build meaning around all of those things. All right? So our sexuality has achieved a type of exaltation that allows us not only to become self-aware, but also to begin to manifest ever more complex, ever more beautiful stories, whereby we can begin to experience the nature of love. And the type of love that we experience as human beings today, it is still in its infancy. Why? Because we don't live forever. So we are constrained by time. And the constrainment of time means that we are constrained by resources. So the limitations of our love tend to revolve around the limitations surrounding resources and the limitations surrounding our lives, the extent of our lives. And what that simply tells us is that there is opportunity to grow. There is opportunity for evolution. Because if we lived longer, for instance, if a human life was 300 years or 400 years, well, the pressures that come from limitations to our love stories, they also begin to dissipate. Okay? You may take more time to find love, or you may become more patient about love, or you may become more understanding, because at the end of the day, the type of love that will be eventually is a love that has no boundaries. A love that has no boundaries in the nature of its understanding, because to love is to know. And the more you know, the more you are able to understand. Okay? Understanding is an accommodation. Understanding is an integration. Understanding is an internalization. Okay? And that's what that sexual function, that's where it's really going to. Why? Well, if you've been listening to my podcast, it's because I explained that sexual function, it really lies at the root of what existence really is. How existence is built, not just as a physical existence, but even as a conceptual existence, because it comes from something more pristine than the physical universe. Now, it is only when it translates itself into a physical universe that is becoming, that's when we see it as sex. But what it is prior to that is just the unity between male and female. A reconciliation of two things into one. Why? Because unity is one thing. But how do you get to that one thing? Well, the surest step to the reconciliation of unity is two things becoming one. It's far less expensive than three things becoming one or four things becoming one. But that's where it's going to. It's going to the fact that you get to the number 2 before you get to 1. And that's the cheapest possible form of unity. Okay? But unity really is expressed at some very deep level in the conceptual space. Because the real idea is that it is the sixness of things that generates that unity. And that's why when you look at the way that all complex life forms, even all life forms, the way they are built, it is dependent on that sixness. Why? It's because it has to build a unified creature. But when it comes to the conceptual archetype or the overall view of that unity, when it comes to things like gender, for instance, you see two sexual organs that are different from each other, but they are a couple in some sense because they're made for each other. So they're made to accommodate each other. So they fit into each other in some sense, in a very natural way that indicates that they were once united. And that's the entire point of it all. It's the realization that there is a unity that exists in the universe at a very conceptual level, whose cheapest manifestation or whose most efficient manifestation is the realization of two things that become one. Okay? That's really what it is. That's what sex is. It's just two things becoming one. And out of that oneness, new life emerges. There's a reason for that. There's a lesson in that. Okay? Like I said, the earth is a very special place. You look into the sky, you see two luminaries, so to speak. And these are the luminaries in astrology. One is the sun, which is the primary luminary, and there's the reflection of that luminary in the moon. But we are indoctrinated into the unity of these two things, even though they are vastly different types of things. But from our perspective on the earth, as human beings, learning to be self-aware, we see their unity in what you can call an eclipse. A solar eclipse or a lunar eclipse, a total eclipse. You see their unity, all right? And these are vastly different phenomena. The sun and the moon have no comparison in terms of size or power. And yet, from the apparent point of self-awareness, observing reality, we see a kind of unity where they blend together into oneness. This is not a coincidence. And it hasn't always been the case, because there was a time when the moon was closer to the earth. You couldn't have a total lunar or a total solar eclipse in that type of condition. So we live not only in a special place, we live at a special time, okay? Because the orbit of the moon is constantly growing. So at some, maybe 1 billion years from now, the moon will be much further from the earth than it is today. And then that perfect alignment will be lost, okay? There are lessons in all of this because we grew up under this. We as human beings, our self-awareness emerged under these types of conditions, okay? So there is a sense of unity that we are born with where two things reconcile into one. It's like a very basic way of understanding reality. Well, this is what Pluto talks about. Because what Pluto represents, even though Pluto is just a functional light, right? And since it's at the edge of the solar system, it doesn't really belong there in some sense. It's a body, that's why it was demoted from being a full planet. It's a planetoid in some sense, and it was captured at some stage, okay? But what it represents is this sexual perspective that is like a nucleus from which self-awareness is growing. Okay, in the animals, that growth is obviously not complete because self-awareness doesn't emerge in the animals. But in the humans, self-awareness finally is like it pierces a veil and the human being becomes aware. But what are you aware of? The primary awareness of the human being is based on sexuality. Even in infants, they just don't know what it is. As you get older, the entire point of adolescence, the translation from your infant stage into kind of becoming a fully grown adult or something like that, it revolves the production of these sexual hormones. And those are the primary changes of behavior. And what they do is they accentuate what's already there. Because prior to that accentuation, these things exist as potentials. And everybody knows that adolescence is like the key stage in development in that sense, in the adult stage. Why? Because you are becoming an adult. Becoming an adult means that you get to face your sexual instincts and they surge during that period. I mean, men have physical changes, women have physical changes. Why? It's because you are getting ready to begin to tell your sexual stories. In fact, the whole point of adulthood is that your sexual stories change. It's time to give them meaning. But before they can be given meaning, they must come to the fore and center of your consciousness. You think it's a random thing, it's a design. Now, this is where the Plutonic forces have their field day. Because whatever you encounter during this period about your sexual desires, you will either bring them out to the surface or you will suppress them. And the Plutonic forces, the Plutonic placements themselves in your natal chart, they're talking about that suppression. Because Pluto is indicated in the natal chart as the suppression of that desire. That raw sexual desire. And there are many reasons why people try to suppress these things. Most of it is predominantly based on their early conditioning. The type of contextual narrative that you are born into, which you call a family. Depends on where you are born in the world, kind of family you're born into, and all the social narratives that have been crafted around these things. You know, even though these are not accidents, you being born into a particular family or within a particular type of social narrative, they are not accidents. Okay, they are designed to work with that Plutonic aspect, to alter your behavior in a certain way so as to guarantee certain types of outcomes. And this is what natal synthesis is all about. Natal chart synthesis is understanding what these outcomes are and how they're being generated by these very basic drives or basic desires or basic forces or basic functional lights. You can call them whatever you want. Okay. Now, the very raw element of this Plutonic force, if it comes out, you consider the person to be very immature, very childlike, very kind of, you should be able to control yourself. You should be able to control that aspect of yourself. So maturity mandates some type of suppression of these desires because its raw form is very offensive in some sense. Because if everybody behaves according to their Plutonic aspects strictly, then you can't really have organized society. So there is a contrasting effect between Saturnian influences and Plutonic influences. That's why when you have Saturn-Pluto conjunct in your natal chart or in some other type of relationship, it's really talking about your ability to control yourself, to control some aspect of that sexual expression. Okay? Now, Saturn cannot really control Pluto because Plutonic forces, they're irrepressible. They bring about gradual transformation, but even though it's gradual, it cannot be stopped. It cannot be repressed. And you cannot go back really, because the type of change they bring about irreversible changes. Okay, such like changes where you have changes in entropy. Okay, that's really very important, very crucial, and they are only triggered because there's an aspect of the psyche that has been suppressed so far down that there is a possibility that the outcomes that Plutonic effect is tied to, there's a possibility now that they wouldn't occur. And nature wouldn't let you do that. Your motives, your desires, as they work together, they won't let you do that. So they will force through the emanation of those desires, through the reality, which is just a story that you have constructed. They will pierce through it. And if they destroy the reality by piercing through it, then so be it. They don't care. That's how deep and powerful they are. And they will do so over time. It will take years, but the outcome is fairly certain. And that's because that Plutonic narrative is tied to the life story that you are living. Okay, so it's not the same for everybody. But for those who have significant Scorpio placements or significant Plutonic placements, then this is inevitable. You cannot escape it. Because any type of narrative Pluto or Scorpio are tied to, they're inevitable in that sense. Okay, because they represent a transformation of the narrative itself. Without that transformation, no outcome. Okay, so the idea is to understand these Plutonic forces as part of ourselves, as part of our sexual stories, to understand them to the point where you understand them as biochemistry. Because astrology may just be talking about behavior, but all behavior is biochemical, right? You have an endocrine system for a reason. Okay, so I already have a podcast where I talk about Pluto's effects in the second house. So here I want to talk about Pluto's effects in the first house. And if I have some time left, I will talk about maybe in another house, because, these things, they're pretty easy to explain, so to speak. Okay. Now, what is the first house really concerned with? The first house is the house that contains the ascendant. So it is the launch pad for self-awareness. And like I've said several times, your ascendant is basically how you begin to tell your story. But it's not just how you begin to tell your story, it's how you always search for the beginning to every story that you are engaged in. So whatever sign sits on your ascendant, you are going to be looking for it primarily in the natural house where that sign is based, but you're going to be looking for it also in every other aspect of your natal chart, every other house. And you're going to be drawn to it by instinct. You're going to be drawn to it by an instinct connected with your ability to start things. So for instance, if you have Scorpio on the ascendant, you'll be drawn to all the matters of the 8th house to start with, but you'll be drawn to them on a very basic level, on the level of initiation. And in the case of Scorpio, the identification or the initiation is always with your partner, meaning that you will identify as your partner. So you will always notice the power dynamics between people or the power dynamics between you and others. You'll be sensitive to it because you want power. And you want power as a way to compensate for the fact that Scorpio is rising on your ascendant. And you want power because you're afraid. Okay, and that transaction is taking place at a very, very fundamental level. It's the oldest transaction that you know of in your psychology. And so the natural tendency of everyone that has that, the natural tendency is to block that. Because those power games, those sexual games, those narratives, they make the person afraid. Okay, so when the person feels powerless, they tend to suppress that aspect of themselves. Now, if that is a key condition or key criteria for your life story, and at some point in time, you will be woken up from that suppression, either through some type of transit, some type of activity that will change your life. Okay, that will have to do with power, money, or sex. But the truth is that these are not different things. The initial impulse is always sexual. But if the sexual impulse is blocked from free expression in that sense, then the individual begins to reprocess that same sexual impulse. They begin to reprocess it as money or the need for power. Why? Because they want to be able to express that sexual part of themselves. And they feel that they're blocked. So based on your life story, you begin to imagine that if I had more capacity or if I had more capability, I can solve this problem. And so the individual goes after money. But the real issue lies in the sexual function. And sometimes the blockage is so powerful, like when you have Pluto in the first house, for instance, the Plutonic force itself doesn't sit as a tangible reality yet. It sits as a motive. So for instance, if you have Scorpio rising and you have Pluto in the first house, this is an extremely powerful placement because it reinforces the theme of that sexuality. And so the person is under a tremendous amount of sexual pressure that may or may not find realization because the first house is a potential. So everything that sits there is looking for a way to express itself. And the individual carries it as a way to express their core identity, as in, why are you here? What brought you into this world? And so they are drawn to narratives that contain these scorpionic or plutonic themes, and they're drawn to it by, you would call it like a first-person syndrome or a first-person impulse. They will always notice all the sexual themes and undercurrents, all the undercurrents of power, all the undercurrents of wealth. They will always notice it because they notice it in themselves. They will always notice the extremes that are generated in their desires. And they will notice the effort that it takes them to suppress these desires and keep them under control. And you know, when you're talking about sex and then the sexual function is blocked, then it begins to investigate everything else. Power, money. Well, that's the door that opens up to envy. Because when you don't have these things and you see other people having them, it is very reflective on you. Because the psyche will ask itself, but why? Why don't I have this? Or why don't I have access to these things? And that's where envy comes from. Now, there are many types of envy. Most of it is very harmless. The really dangerous ones are the ones that are fueled by extremism, whereby the person is motivated to hurt another person as a way to pacify the envy that they feel. Now, the moment when they do that, something crystallizes. Because envy is just a potential. It's just an idea in the head, okay? It really doesn't have any actual form, because you can become envious of something and you can direct the challenge inwards, whereby you now feel the need to develop yourself to a certain extent in very constructive ways so that you can have the things that you admire. Okay, but you can also go ahead and become self-destructive. And once you crystallize that self-destruction in the form of harming another person in a way to pacify that thing that you feel, then you have crystallized the fact that you are behind this person. You have implemented it as a reality, and it's not going anywhere. It's a Plutonic drive. The nature of it is that it will come back to test you, because whatever advantage you gain from that, it represents an abuse of power. And one of the key lessons of Pluto and Scorpio is a test of power. Now, it's not that you cannot have power. Once you have Scorpio or Pluto placements in your natal chart in important positions, you already have power. You just don't know what it is, and you don't know how to use it. And therein lies the life lesson. It's always linked to that, how you use power. And power is the nature of influence. Okay, and there are two ways you can use power. Now, the lesson that is in Scorpio and Pluto is that you must not use power in a direct way, because then the focus of that activity turns on the self. Okay, and you direct Plutonic forces at yourself. You're not powerful enough for Plutonic forces. They're far older and more powerful than you. They go back into before your self-consciousness. And so once you do that, they will destroy you. They may initially reward you in that you get to take whatever you want. You get to bully whoever you want. You get to ride roughshod over anything that you really want. But ultimately, they are detrimental, because your psyche, your self-awareness emerges from that. It cannot handle the full force of that. The way that the psyche, the human self-awareness, the way that it copes with the power of its sexual stories is that it looks for beauty in them. Okay? And when the stories are not beautiful, on an unconscious, deep sexual level, it begins to resent itself. Because self-awareness is something that is an elevation. And in order to maintain self-awareness, that elevation is constantly accounted for. And the way that the accounting is done is in these beautiful stories. And envy and its implementation, they are not beautiful stories. They're as ugly as they come. And when the individual sees this, it tries to compensate. It tries by telling different types of stories. It tries to say, oh, that's not what really happened. I was acting on a different impulse. And so it creates denial. Denial is a temporary shield that the self-awareness creates in order to shield it from the shame that comes from its ugliness. But denial, like I said, is temporary. It's a construction of your mind, really. The construction of your will. It cannot survive the power of that sexual function, the power of that Plutonic force. And so what happens during transits or Plutonic transits or whatever, that these stories are shattered. And they always feel as if something is being lost, something is dying or something. Well, it's the story that you created because it's not beautiful. Now, in your natal synthesis, every natal chart has a beautiful story attached to it. And the Plutonic forces are part of that process. So it's a very complex thing to understand how this beauty emerges from these Plutonic forces, because they're not the only ones there. Okay, but when Pluto is in your first house, it's harder to achieve beauty in that sense, because it's a very potent position. The first house is a very dominating house in the sense that it's a launch pad. And so the individual unconsciously looks for everything Plutonic, whether they're aware of it or not. They look for it as a way of making sense of their own self. And the nature of these types of things is that they get to sit. And they get to sit in the fourth house, because you can think of it as an evolution or water that flows downhill. It wants to flow into the fourth house where it can now sit as a conviction. Okay? And it's always very difficult for those things to sit, because Pluto doesn't belong in the first house. So it doesn't belong in that first sphere of experience or that first quadrant of experience. So that if they're not sitting correctly, then the individual is swamped by the result of all their repressions. And like I said, that's what envy looks like. Because envy is the key or the nucleus of all human dysfunctional behavior. Envy. It always starts from there. It's the root for all manners of ugliness. Now, every human being feels envy, don't get me wrong. It's an important part of who we are. Its purpose is to spring you into higher constructive activity, or you self-destruct. And all of it has to do with how you interpret your sexual function. That's why it's always very important. As such, those that see themselves as sexually capable, they have no need to really push that power need out there. They have no need to really compensate in that way. Because what they're looking for out there, they can really find some part of it within themselves, and especially within whatever relationships that they find themselves. Okay? When young people begin to become very aware of sex and their sexual function, it's very important that they understand the power behind it. It's not a bad thing. You just have to understand what it is and how it affects you. It dominates your worldview. It dominates your thinking. But you have to elevate it so that it doesn't fall back on you. You have to constantly grow it and elevate it so it doesn't collapse back on you, because you can think of it as the power of a black hole. And the idea is to elevate it to the point where you can now seek its realization with another. Because the idea of the Plutonic force is to connect you to something or someone else, whereby both of you can plunge to the depths of each other. Of course, in a healthy way, not a disastrous way, because obsessions are built on these types of things. Okay? And that connection with another, I've described it as a seeking of knowledge. For instance, when you are terribly drawn to someone, in a healthy way, there's some obsession that is healthy. Love itself is not some type of obsession. But the way that the obsession works in love is that you're not trying to possess the person in the sense that you are trying to deprive them of oxygen because you want to possess them completely. That's not how it works. You create a corpse, and what is the point? How can you love someone that you're trying to kill? So knowing when to let go is part of the Plutonic Scorpionic lesson. And that's why Pluto in the first house, it's very powerful. In fact, I can be bold enough to say that there is no other placement of Pluto that is more powerful in terms of what it can create and what it can destroy than when it's in the first house. Because when it goes wrong, the collapse is always with the self, meaning that you can build all sorts of things with that Plutonic force, and then if not built correctly, when the collapse occurs, it will decimate your entire base of self-consciousness. It will feel like dying. Okay? Because that first house is where all the narratives start from. And when transformations occur, every narrative that does not fit the Plutonic agenda, they are destroyed. And so that will feel like reversing everything back to when you were a child, in some sense. And that can be very painful. The major problem with Pluto in the first house is that its life lesson revolves around learning how to take. Because when Pluto is in the first house, it's like a story between Mars and Pluto. There is an extreme potential for violence, not just directed at the person, but the person can become violent towards others because it has so much pressure underneath it in order to act or in order to take. And when it becomes scared, when it becomes spooked, then it begins to construct all sorts of defenses around this narrative, whereby it begins to project that it's not the taker, someone is taking from it. But that's not true. Because Pluto in the first house, they are notorious for attracting bullies, because in order to implement the fear, because they are afraid of themselves, they are afraid of their own power, they're afraid of how to use that power because they don't know what it is. So they basically just deny it, even though it's there. They seethe underneath, but since they cannot grab the power for themselves, because probably they don't know how to, then the power is imposed on them. So they're very notorious for attracting bullies and people who just want to rob them of their own individual sovereignty. Well, at some point in time, the Pluto within them kicks in, because what they need to do is they need to find that balance. They need to find a way to carry that power because they already have it. And people who are drawn to them, they can sense that power. And those people, they are power deprived. And so they come to take that power as a way to compensate for themselves. So it's left for the person with Pluto in the first house to say, wait a minute. It's time to let go. And letting go is very, very difficult for Pluto in the first house. Because that Plutonic force, once it connects, and in the first house, it connects with everything, or tries to connect with everything, because the person doesn't have any other way of being. It's their first house representation. They carry that emotional intensity. All right? The emotional intensity is always there for something. It's always there for ambition. And you can imagine ambition to be your most straightened self. Because remember, the entire point of walking erect on two legs is that you are trying to elevate a sexual story. So that ambition sits in the 10th house, which is like the most elevated, the most straightened out part of you. That's where that Plutonic energy is really destined for. It's the energy to get to that point. So how you get to that point is crucially important. Okay, because the Plutonic energy, it must generate Sagittarius. If that translation is not done correctly, then the individual will experience a fall. That's how it is. So because Pluto is sitting in the first house, every time the individual takes in such a way that does not correspond to the proper use of that power, then they will set up a sequence of events that it may take a while, but it ultimately backfires. So that the individual, having expressed that power in that way, they ultimately get to experience powerlessness. And that is the transformation. Now, it may come in different types of ways, depending on what sign is producing that Plutonic force. Okay, if the Pluto is being produced by Scorpio, then you should watch out, because the transformation can be so devastating. All right, remember, death itself is also a transformation. It's a final transformation, and that's what Pluto fears the most: death. So those who have Pluto in the first house in being produced by Scorpio, for instance, they have to be careful, because it may not be their death, it may be the death of the other. Okay, a kind of loss like that, irreversible loss. But everything else in the natal chart needs to support this, otherwise it doesn't make any sense. These are individual placements, they are not fated in that sense. When you have Pluto in the first house, when your transformations occur, they change your sense of identity, even the way that you look. Now, traditionally, Pluto in the first house, there is an intensity already around you. That intensity, that emotional intensity, it is the source of power. So you have to know that wherever you go, if you walk into a room or whatever, you are exuding a sexuality, a magnetism. That's the best way to describe it. It's like an animal magnetism, because that Pluto, normally it sits very deep, like I've said earlier. But when it's in the first house, it's like sitting in front of you. So people see it. Okay? And that is power. Sex is the basis of power. All right? And so it comes out in the first house. It's like an allure. Now, the person tries to conceal it, which is ridiculous, because it even makes it even more easy to spot if you know what to look for. All right? But by the necessity of what it is, because the person is afraid of it, it's in the house where you are constantly trying to push things out by force. So they are very well restrained in that sense. There's a poise about them. And it's almost like an inscrutability, but it's not. It is a barrier, because the person is afraid of themselves and they're afraid of others in that sense. So there is a barrier there that is meant to frighten off people who cannot readily cope with that type of emotional intensity. So it's like a screen. All right. But anyone who brave enough to cut across this barrier into the individual, that's to cut across the fact that the individual's face might appear very scary, but it's part of the allure. Once they're brave enough to cross that, then they come into a world of someone who can be very warm and very nice, very loving. But there's a catch. You are dealing with an extremely serious person. I mean, this person's seriousness, the intensity of it is so much that if you're not aware of it, it will bite you. It will sting you at some point in time, because you have come into a world that is deeply private, and you must respect that privacy. Very crucial, very important, because any attempt to betray that privacy, it will be seen as a betrayal of the person themselves. And these are people who get hurt so easily because they're very sensitive to that Pluto, that once a hurt is betrayed, it takes them maybe forever to overcome that. Even if they forget about it, every time they think of it, it will appear very fresh. And you know what the Plutonic drive is. Once you hurt them, they won't just go cry. They will hit back. That's how painful they experience these things. So once you're dealing with someone like this, you have to know that you're dealing with a potential that can really be an extremely palatable love experience, or it can be your nightmare. You have to decide when you meet such people, you have to decide which one of them that you are going to bring out, because you have to know that you are dealing with something that is very powerful. So you have to deal with it with respect. And if possible, address the issue head on. Because Pluto in the first house, they're not afraid of darkness. I mean, they've experienced within themselves every type of taboo you can imagine. Every type of negative thought that you can imagine. They have thought about it already. In fact, there is a sense in which they are it, and they have to keep restraining themselves from being it. Okay? So if you think you're going to scare them off by talking about something very deep and serious, well, you ain't. So that's the respect I'm talking about. And if you're in a casual mood with this type of people, let them know. If you try to deceive this type of person, you have created for yourself an enemy. Whether they tell you or not, because they will seek revenge. Okay? And they will seek, Plutonic people, interactions with them, they are life-changing and life-transforming. That's how it goes. That's just the way that it is. And so part of the life lesson of this person is to learn to manage that power. Okay? To not be abusive with that power, because it is power. It is also very important that people who have Pluto in the first house, they have to embrace that life can be dangerous. It heightens all their senses, and that sense of heightened awareness, it's a pleasure if they know how to use it, because it gets their blood pumping, their heart racing. It's exciting for them, but obviously it can also be dangerous. So Pluto in the first house is an awareness of danger, and it's an awareness of the person's extremely powerful creative and destructive forces. Okay, and so one of the things I recommend with Pluto in the first house is that once you're dealing with them, you have to be as open and as transparent as possible if you want to be serious with them. And don't let them scare you in the sense that there are some things you can't talk about. No. In fact, the danger is that once you become very alluring to this person in the way that you approach them, the way that you deal with them, the problem they always have is letting go. Okay? Especially if you are able to touch that plutonic part of them, which is deeply sexual. These people really have no interest in sleeping around. But if you can give them that orgasmic experience that represents the knowledge that is being suppressed by that Pluto, well, you're going to have a hard time letting go of these people or getting them to let go of you. So if you're not a serious if you're really not that serious, then you better declare that right from the beginning, because such a powerful friend can also become a very powerful enemy. And you can't really blame them. That's the way they're built, because it's tied to their own life story. So when you come into the house of this person in a figurative sense, you have to make your intentions well known, because they're already afraid of you. They're already suspicious of you. And the worst thing you can do is to give those suspicions fuel or energy to grow. Pluto in the first house is extremely intense. The intensity is concealed, and they conceal that intensity when dealing with others. But everything begins to change when they meet people that are like them. They become like two black holes orbiting each other. And it may not be pleasant initially, but they are drawn to each other. It's the intensity of that Plutonic force. Because if there's an attraction there, it means that there is an explanation about this person's identity that is buried in the depth of the other person. It's not necessarily the full explanation. It may just be a part of it. Within that person, they can catch a glimpse of what they are like in that sense. And so there's a very strong attraction. But these things can be difficult to handle, okay? Because it depends on how the other person's Plutonic forces are sitting. But normally, when such people come together, it's always life-changing. And the difficulty revolves around being able to let go amicably. There's no amicably in these types of situations. When things end and they don't end well, they end rather catastrophically. Okay? Where you can imagine that two people are trying to undo each other in a very serious way. All right, so that's why I say that these things are not easy to handle, but they deliver the greatest, most intense sexual experiences. Okay, if you're looking for a place to settle down in terms of where you want to settle down, there's nobody more intense or more interesting than the Plutonic person. Once they have sorted out their desires, because Pluto being where you are repressing those desires, the individual might repress to the point where it's completely blocked. And so they seek compensations in power and money. And they then use these as terrorizing tools to control people, to manipulate them, to force them into different types of behavior, because they don't want to address the deficiency of power that they find within themselves. And this can be a nasty thing, because that's the recipe for terrorism. Okay, so people who are compensated in this type of way, they suppress that desire because there's something wrong with it, usually the result of shame. And you can usually see patterns like this when the type of aspects that Pluto makes with Saturn and the type of aspects that Saturn then makes to the sun or to the moon. They conceal a part of themselves shamefully in some sense, but that part has power in it, meaning it has a powerful sexual drive with it. And so because they're not willing to explore that and heal it, because Plutonic healing revolves around bringing things into the light, because Pluto takes its power from the depth of the psyche. When you bring it into the light, which is a process of honesty, and as scary as it sounds to the Plutonic person, this is what heals the Plutonic psyche, and it causes the power need to sit in a better position than when it's just a voracious monster, because it's compensating for a deficit that is not really there. Okay, and that's a very interesting thing. It's not really there, but the person doesn't know that it's not really there. And so they begin to compensate, and those have a tremendous impact on the person because they will eventually correct. And when they do, they are devastating and life transforming. Okay,